The ruins stretched endlessly across the Valley of Bones, their crumbling arches and shattered pillars standing as silent witnesses to the cataclysm that had unfolded here centuries ago. At the heart of this desolate expanse stood a single sword, its blade driven deep into an ancient altar, humming with a faint, ominous glow that pulsed like a slumbering heartbeat. The air around it shimmered with residual magic, distorting the light into patterns that twisted and wavered, unsettling to any who dared to gaze for too long. Before this relic knelt a lone figure, encased in armor so ancient that it had fused with his flesh, the corroded metal merging with his skin through centuries of silent vigil. His face, barely discernible beneath a weathered helmet, bore the deep fissures of time, cracks like sun-baked clay etched into his flesh, his eyes hollow and unblinking, fixed upon the imprisoned blade. He had no name anymore, not truly. The world had long since forgotten him, just as it had forgotten the 4 warriors who had fought and perished beside him on this very ground. Now he was simply the warden, the eternal guardian, cursed with immortality to stand watch over the prison of a fallen god for all eternity. His rusted gauntlets traced the hilt of the sword as they did once every century, feeling the dark pulse of the entity trapped within. The god still raged against its confinement, its divine fury hammering at the seal like waves battering a crumbling shore. And as the wind howled through the ruins, carrying with it the whispers of the long dead, the warden remembered. He remembered the final battle, the desperate struggle, the moment when 5 mortals had dared to stand against divine annihilation and paid the ultimate price. He remembered the agonized screams of his comrades, the acrid scent of burning flesh and ozone, the way the very earth had trembled beneath them as they fought. But more than anything, he remembered the exact moment the world was saved, and he was damned to this unending vigil. The war against Valthor the Undying had been swift and merciless, a divine purge that swept across the kingdoms of men like a scythe through wheat. Once revered as a god of wisdom and protection, Valthor had turned against his followers without warning or reason. Perhaps it was madness that consumed him, or perhaps it was the inevitable result of an eternal being growing weary of mortal frailty. Whatever the cause, his wrath had been absolute. Cities crumbled to ash beneath his gaze, their stone walls melting like wax before the inferno of his divine fire. Armies dissolved into clouds of blood mist with the mere flick of his hand. Kings and queens knelt before him, their crowns liquefying as they pleaded for mercy that would never come. The land itself rebelled at his presence. Rivers flowed backward, forests petrified where his shadow passed, and the very earth cracked open to devour entire villages whole. In the last free kingdom of Eldrin, where the banners still flew in defiance of the encroaching darkness, 5 souls made their final stand. At their forefront stood Garren, the warrior king who had already lost everything. His kingdom had been the first to fall, his family the first to be taken when Valthor's judgment descended. He remembered with agonizing clarity the last moments in his burning palace, the way his wife's hand had slipped from his grasp as the ceiling collapsed, the terrified screams of his children swallowed by the roar of the flames. Now, all that remained to him was his sword. Dragonfang, a blade forged in the heart of a dying volcano and quenched in dragon's blood. Its edge shimmered with barely contained power, ancient runes glowing faintly even in the stillness. Garren's grip on the hilt was ironclad, his muscles taut with the resolve of a man who had nothing left to lose. As he and his companions approached the Valley of the End, where Valthor awaited them, the weight of destiny settled upon his shoulders. Beside Garren walked Liora, the silver-haired sorceress whose eyes carried the weight of countless prophecies. Her hair, like moonlight on snow, marked her as one touched by deep magic since birth. The spellbook at her hip was filled with calculations of doom, each page crammed with equations that all led to the same terrible conclusion. Today was either the end of everything or the beginning of a new age. Her fingers trembled slightly as she traced the runes carved into her staff, the wood worn smooth from centuries of use by her order. She had seen the future in her visions, a world unmade, its people reduced to screaming shadows, the very fabric of reality unravelling at Valthor's whim. The knowledge sat heavy in her chest, a cold stone of certainty that this was their only chance. To her right marched Dain Ironvein, the dwarf cleric whose faith had outlasted even his god. The holy symbol around his neck, once radiant with divine light, was now just a piece of cracked metal, its power extinguished when Valthor had slain Dain's deity in the celestial realms. Yet still the dwarf prayed, his lips moving silently in rituals that no longer had a recipient. His mace, once glowing with golden light, was dull and lifeless in his grip, but his determination burned all the brighter for it. "Just one more miracle," he whispered to the uncaring sky, his voice rough with emotion. "That's all I ask, one final blessing to see this done." At the rear of their small party moved Riven the ghost, a shadow given human form. Where the others had noble purpose or righteous fury, Riven had only vengeance. He cared nothing for gods or kings, had no stake in the survival of kingdoms or civilizations. But he had seen what Valthor's passing left in its wake. Villages where children's skeletons still clutched toys in their charred fingers. Forests full of petrified animals caught mid-flight. His daggers, Soulrend and Night's Kiss, were black as void and just as hungry. He tested their edges absently as they walked, drawing thin lines of blood on his thumb that he barely felt. The pain was an anchor, a reminder that he still lived when so many others did not. Completing their grim quintet was Elyra Swiftwind, the elven archer whose eyes held the grief of an entire slaughtered people. Her forest home had been among the first targets when Valthor's madness began. Its ancient trees turned to glass statues in an instant. Each arrow in her quiver bore the name of a fallen kinsman, carved in delicate script, and she whispered their names as she walked, a litany of the dead. Her bow, Moon's Whisper, was carved from sacred wood that had once grown in her homeland's heart, and it thrummed with barely contained power as they approached their destiny. The Valley of the End lived up to its name, a shattered wasteland where the very air tasted of lightning and despair. The sky above churned with unnatural colours, purple and green clouds swirling in patterns that hurt the eyes to follow. The ground beneath their feet was cracked and brittle, each footstep sending up puffs of ash that had once been living things. At the valley's centre stood Valthor, and the sight of him struck them all momentarily dumb. The god hovered a few feet above the broken earth, his 6 wings of living flame casting shifting shadows across the blasted landscape. His form was at once human and utterly alien, beautiful in the way a lightning storm is beautiful, terrible in the way an earthquake is terrible. His eyes burned with the light of dying stars, and when he spoke, his voice came from everywhere at once, vibrating through their bones. "You amuse me," he said, the words dripping with divine condescension, like mayflies declaring war on the sun. The air itself screamed in protest as he descended slightly, his mere presence causing the ground to crack further, molten rock bubbling up through new fissures. Garren tightened his grip on Dragonfang, feeling the sword's runes flare to life beneath his fingers. "Liora! Now!" he barked, his voice cutting through the god's oppressive aura. The sorceress reacted instantly, driving her staff into the fractured earth with a shout. Aegis of the 7th Dawn. A dome of crackling violet energy erupted around them just as Valthor flicked his wrist in a casual, almost bored gesture. The god's attack wasn't fire or lightning or any mundane force. It was the land itself turning against them. The valley floor erupted in 100 stone spears that shot upward like a grotesque garden, each jagged spike aimed to impale. Leora's barrier deflected the main assault, but the concussive force sent hairline fractures racing across its surface. The ground beneath them buckled violently, new fissures opening like hungry mouths. Dain, with his dwarven sensitivity to stone, felt the coming tremors before they hit. "Left!" he roared, his voice cutting through the chaos. The party scattered just as a massive stone column burst from where they'd stood, the projectile missing them by inches. Riven used the debris as stepping stones, his cloak flaring dramatically as he performed his phantom gambit technique, leaving after images among the falling rubble to confuse his trajectory. The rogue moved like liquid shadow, his form blurring between reality and illusion as he closed. Elyra knocked 3 arrows simultaneously, her fingers moving with practiced ease despite the chaos around them. "Fang of Winter!" she cried, releasing the projectiles in quick succession. Each arrow struck a separate stone pillar, flash freezing them instantly. Riven rebounded off these newly created icy surfaces, his movements gaining impossible momentum as he closed the distance to Valthor. The god raised an eyebrow at their coordination, just as Garren's sword slammed into the ground with a thunderous impact. "Dragon's wake!" the warrior king bellowed, sending a fissure racing toward Valthor that forced the deity to hover higher, right into Riven's path. The rogue's twin daggers flashed, Soulrend and Night's Kiss, both finding purchase in the god's side. Valthor's blood, molten gold and burning with divine fire, dripped onto the frozen stones below where it exploded in geysers of superheated steam. "Interesting," the god mused, his voice betraying the first hint of genuine emotion since their arrival. Then he clapped his hands together with world-shattering force. The resulting concussion wave shattered every standing stone in a mile radius, sending deadly shrapnel flying in all directions. Dain moved faster than his stocky frame suggested possible, slamming his mace down with a roar. "Bulwark of Faith!" A golden shield formed around them just in time, but the impact drove the dwarf to his knees, his arms trembling with the effort of maintaining the barrier. Liora wasn't idle during this reprieve. Her fingers traced intricate runes in the airborne dust, creating a mirror of mists that split their images a dozen-fold across the battlefield. Valthor laughed, a sound that made the remaining standing stones vibrate dangerously. "You think shadows fool a god?" he mocked, just before the third eye on his forehead slid open with a sickening wet sound. Reality itself seemed to stutter as Valthor's true power manifested. Gravity inverted without warning, sending loose stones and debris floating upward. Elyra's braid whipped skyward before she could react, but her archer's reflexes saved her. An instant later, her anchor shot buried itself in the bedrock, the rope tied around Garren's waist, keeping them both grounded. Time fractured around them. Liora watched in horror as her fingers moved backward through spell gestures, her body trapped in a temporal loop until she bit her tongue hard enough to draw blood, using the pain to anchor herself in the present. "Kronos Ward," she gasped through a mouthful of blood, the spell forming a fragile bubble of stable time around them. Space folded in on itself. Riven's lunge came from behind his own knee, the rogue barely avoiding gutting himself with his own dagger. The battlefield had become a nightmare of impossible physics, where up and down lost meaning and caused no longer reliably preceded effect. Dain, bleeding from a dozen wounds, made his decision. With a roar that echoed across the broken valley, he drove his mace into the unstable ground. The impact sent a shockwave through the floating debris, momentarily disrupting Valthor's spatial distortions. "Martyr's Gambit," the dwarf rasped, black flames erupting from his holy symbol. "My soul for one strike." The flames spread across his body, consuming him even as they granted him the power to challenge a god. Their final combination attack unfolded with desperate precision. Elyra fired her last phoenix arrow into the floating debris field. The explosion created a momentary firestorm that burned away temporal distortions. Riven used Fate Sever, his daggers cutting not flesh but the very threads of probability holding Valthor's form together. Liora collapsed to her knees, her staff shattering as she unleashed Grand Annulment, a sphere of anti-magic that turned the floating stones into a hail of mundane projectiles. Garren leapt from a still-floating boulder, Dragonfang screaming downward in the Sundering Fang technique, only for Valthor to blur aside with impossible speed. The god's counterblow would have vaporized Garren's chest, had Dain not intercepted, the dwarf taking the divine strike directly through his sternum. "Now!" the dying cleric roared, black flames erupting from his wounds to bind Valthor momentarily. Garren's sword plunged into the god's chest, not into flesh but into the very concept of his divinity. The impact sent shockwaves through the valley, toppling what few standing stones remained. The floating debris crashed down in a meteor shower of stone and earth. The cracked ground sealed itself in concentric circles radiating from the impact point. The very air stilled, as if the world itself held its breath. Valthor's scream shattered the remaining stone formations as he grabbed Garren's face with one burning hand, only for Elyra's last dagger, forged from a shard of the moon itself, to find his wrist. "The earth remembers you," she spat as the blade severed divine tendons. Then came the white light, pure and all-consuming. When it faded, only silence remained. A sword stood embedded in stone. 5 bodies lay broken around it, and one man, cursed with immortality, rose to begin his eternal vigil. The warden knelt before the seal, his fingers brushing the hilt as he had done every day for centuries, listening to the gods' endless screams within. The world forgot their sacrifice, but the land remembered. The valley's scars would never heal, just as the warden's vigil would never end, for the sword must never be drawn, and the god must never wake.